Silence removes your need for approval. Most people believe that speaking up is a form of strength. They assume that responding quickly, explaining their position, and making themselves understood is how they maintain control in any interaction. But what they fail to notice is that the urgency to speak often reveals something deeper. It reveals a need. Not a need for clarity, but a need to be accepted, validated, or agreed with. And the moment that need enters your behavior, your control begins to shift. The impulse to respond is rarely neutral. It is usually triggered by discomfort. Someone misunderstands you, questions you, or challenges your position, and immediately there is a pull to correct it, to explain, to restore how you are perceived. That pull feels justified, even necessary. But what most people miss is that in that moment they are no longer acting from stability. They are reacting to perception. And once your behavior becomes tied to how others see you, you are no longer fully in control of it. Silence interrupts this pattern. Not as avoidance, but as a deliberate refusal to operate from that need. When you choose not to respond immediately, you create distance between stimulus and reaction. In that space, something becomes visible. You begin to see that not every misunderstanding requires correction. Not every comment requires engagement. Not every perception needs to be managed. And more importantly, you begin to realize that your value does not increase simply because you make yourself understood. What most people overlook is that constant explanation reduces psychological weight. When everything about you is expressed, clarified, and justified, there is nothing left to observe. No depth, no restraint, no uncertainty. And without uncertainty, there is no tension. Human perception is drawn to what is not fully revealed. When you speak less, people begin to observe more. When you do not immediately explain yourself, others begin to interpret, to question, to think. And that shift changes the dynamic entirely. Silence, in this sense, is not passive. It is selective. It is the ability to decide what deserves your voice and what does not. And that decision is what removes the need for approval. Because when you are no longer speaking to manage perception, you are no longer dependent on how that perception forms. You allow others to think what they will, not out of indifference, but out of control. There is also a deeper psychological effect that occurs. When you do not respond in the way others expect, it creates tension not in you, but in them. They are left without the feedback they anticipated. The emotional loop they initiated does not close. And without closure, their attention shifts inward. They begin to question their own assumptions, their own interpretation of you. Not because you forced them to, but because your silence removed the certainty they were relying on. This is where most people misunderstand power. They think it is expressed through words, through dominance in conversation, through having the last say. But in reality, power is often revealed in what you choose not to say. In your ability to remain composed when others are reacting. In your willingness to let a moment pass without inserting yourself into it. That restraint is what separates controlled behavior from reactive behavior. As this becomes consistent, your presence begins to change. You are no longer someone who can be easily drawn into every interaction. You are not predictable in the way others expect. And because of that, your silence starts to carry meaning. Not because it is forced, but because it is chosen. People begin to sense that when you do speak, it is intentional, and when you do not, it is equally intentional. Unpredictability creates psychological weight. Most people operate in patterns they don't even realize they have. They respond quickly, speak when expected, react in familiar ways, and reveal their thoughts without much filtering. Over time, this creates something subtle but important: predictability. Others begin to understand how they behave, what triggers them, when they will respond, and how they will react under pressure. And once someone becomes predictable, they also become easier to navigate, easier to anticipate, and ultimately easier to influence. What most people fail to recognize is that predictability reduces psychological presence. When others know exactly how you will respond, there is no tension in the interaction, no uncertainty, no need to pay close attention. Your behavior becomes part of a pattern that others can operate around without thinking deeply about it. And when that happens, your impact weakens not because you lack substance, but because you have become readable in a way that removes complexity. Silence disrupts this pattern. Not because it is mysterious on its own, but because it interrupts expectation. When someone anticipates a response and it does not come, the dynamic shifts. The attention that was once directed outward you begins to turn inward. They begin to question. Why didn't you respond? What does your silence mean? Did they misinterpret something? That moment of uncertainty creates psychological weight, not through force, but through absence. Human behavior is naturally drawn to what it cannot fully understand. When something is slightly out of reach, it does not follow expected patterns, it becomes more significant. Not necessarily because it is important, but because it is unresolved. Your silence creates that unresolved space. It introduces a level of unpredictability that others are not used to navigating. This unpredictability does not come from random behavior. It comes from control. You are not silent all the time, and you are not unpredictable in a chaotic sense. You are selective. You respond when it aligns with your intention, not when it aligns with expectation. And that difference is what creates presence. Others cannot rely on a fixed pattern, so they begin to observe more carefully. What most people misunderstand is that this effect is not about intimidating others. It is about removing the ability for others to easily define you. When your behavior cannot be quickly categorized, it creates a subtle form of distance. Not physical distance, but interpretive distance. People are less certain about where they stand with you, less confident in predicting your reactions. And that uncertainty changes how they engage. Over time, this shifts the balance in interactions. Instead of you adjusting to others, others begin to adjust to you. Not because you demand it, but because your behavior requires it. They become more measured, more aware, more cautious in how they approach you. And that shift happens without confrontation, without explanation, without force. It happens because your silence removed the predictability they were relying on. This is where psychological weight begins to form, not in what you say, but in what you withhold. Not in how much you express, but in how much you control your expression. When people cannot fully read you, they begin to assign more significance to your presence. They listen more carefully, observe more closely, and interpret more deeply, not because you are doing more, but because you are revealing less. As this becomes consistent, your interactions begin to change in subtle ways. You are no longer pulled into every conversation with the same intensity. You are no longer expected to respond immediately. And most importantly, you are no longer defined by a predictable pattern of behavior. Your silence becomes part of your presence, not as an absence of communication, but as a form of controlled unpredictability that others cannot easily navigate or dismiss. Emotional restraint disrupts their expectations. Most people believe control is about what you say in a moment of tension. They focus on finding the right words, the right response, the right argument. But what they fail to see is that the real moment of power happens before any words are spoken. It happens in the space where you feel the urge to react and decide not to. That urge is immediate. Someone challenges you, questions you, disrespects you, or misreads your intentions, and your instinct is to respond, to correct the situation, to reassert your position. That reaction feels justified because it protects your identity. But what most people overlook is that this instinct is predictable. And predictability, especially in emotional situations, is what gives others leverage. When someone provokes a reaction from you, they gain something subtle but important. They gain confirmation. They understand what affects you, what pulls you into engagement, what shifts your emotional state. And once that pattern becomes visible, it becomes repeatable. Not because they are always consciously trying to control you, but because human behavior naturally reinforces what produces a clear outcome. This is why emotional restraint is not just about staying calm, it is about interrupting a pattern. When you do not react in the way others expect, the sequence breaks. The emotional loop they initiated does not complete. They are left without the response they anticipated, and that creates a different kind of tension that moves away from you and back toward them. What most people miss is that restraint changes the direction of attention. When you react, attention stays on you. Your response becomes the focus. But when you remain composed and choose not to engage immediately, attention shifts. The other person begins to process their own behavior, their own assumptions, their own position, not because you forced them to, but because your silence removed the distraction of reaction. This is where discipline becomes critical, because the challenge is not in understanding this concept, it is in applying it in real time. When you feel the pressure to respond, the internal discomfort is real. It feels like something needs to be said. But discipline is the ability to stay with that discomfort without acting on it, to allow the moment to exist without immediately resolving it through words. Over time, this creates a shift in how you are perceived. You are no longer seen as someone who reacts impulsively. You are not easily drawn into emotional exchanges. And because of that, others begin to adjust their behavior around you, not necessarily out of respect in the traditional sense, but out of awareness. They become less certain about how to approach you, less confident in provoking a reaction. This does not make you distant or unapproachable. It makes you stable. Your behavior is no longer shaped by immediate emotional input. It is guided by intention. And that intention is what removes unnecessary engagement. You are no longer responding to maintain your position, you are choosing when engagement is worth your energy. There is also a deeper transformation that occurs. As you practice restraint consistently, your internal state begins to stabilize. Situations that once triggered immediate reactions begin to lose their intensity, not because they have changed, but because your relationship to them has changed. You are no longer pulled into every moment with the same urgency. This is where emotional restraint becomes more than a technique. It becomes a way of operating. You are aware of everything, but you are not influenced by everything. You recognize what is happening around you, but you are not compelled to participate in every dynamic. And in that space, your silence begins to carry a different kind of meaning, not as avoidance, but as controlled presence that others cannot easily disrupt or predict. Detachment turns silence into authority. There comes a stage where your silence is no longer misunderstood. It is recognized, not immediately, and not by everyone, but gradually. The same behavior that once seemed passive begins to carry weight. People who once expected responses from you begin to hesitate, not because you have changed externally in a dramatic way, but because your internal position has shifted. Most people move through life in reaction to what surrounds them. Their emotions rise and fall based on interactions, opinions, and external feedback. This creates a subtle dependency. Their state is not entirely their own. It is influenced, shaped, and often controlled by what happens around them. And because of that, their behavior remains accessible. Others can reach them, affect them, and alter their direction through simple triggers. Detachment breaks this accessibility, not by disconnecting from reality, but by disconnecting from emotional dependence on it. You are still aware, still present, still engaged when necessary, but your internal state is no longer tied to external reactions. And once that connection is removed, something changes in how you move. Silence becomes a natural extension of this detachment, not forced, not strategic in an obvious sense, but consistent. You no longer feel the need to fill every space with explanation. You no longer feel compelled to respond to every situation. And most importantly, you no longer measure your position based on how others interpret you. This creates a kind of stability that is difficult to disturb. What most people do not notice is how this stability affects others. When someone interacts with you and does not receive the expected emotional feedback, the dynamic shifts. The patterns they are used to provoking a response, creating tension, drawing engagement no longer work in the same way. And without that feedback, their attention begins to turn inward. They begin to question their own approach, their own assumptions, their own position in the interaction. This is where silence begins to carry authority. Not because it is loud or assertive, but because it is consistent and unshaken. People begin to recognize that your behavior is not easily influenced, that your responses are not automatic, that your engagement is not guaranteed, and that recognition changes how they approach you. Over time, this creates a different kind of presence. You are no longer defined by what you say or how often you respond. You are defined by how steady you remain regardless of the situation. That steadiness becomes visible, even if it is not openly acknowledged. Others begin to adjust their behavior not because you demanded it, but because your lack of reaction removed the usual points of influence. The deeper realization is that authority does not come from controlling others. It comes from controlling your own internal state. When you are no longer pulled by external reactions, you are no longer operating within the same emotional framework as those around you, and that difference creates distance, not physical, but psychological. In that space, your silence is no longer empty. It is understood as intentional, as controlled, as something that does not need to be explained to carry meaning. And when that meaning is consistently reinforced through your behavior, it changes the way you are perceived. At that point, you are no longer trying to appear strong, composed, or in control. You are simply operating from a place where those qualities are no longer dependent on the situation. And in that quiet consistency, your presence begins to influence the environment without effort, without force, and without the need to prove anything further.